The New York City Draft Riots were among the deadliest riots in American history when they took place. But today, many people do not know that they even occurred. The rebellion began on Monday, July 13, 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. It was a time when Northern men between the ages of 20 to 45 were eligible to be drafted into the war. Many New Yorkers began rioting because they did not want to be forced to fight. The problem was that a compromise had been made between the rich and the federal government that offered the elites a way out of service, and those who were poor did not like it at all.
This led to the Civil War being nicknamed a rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
The conflict began when the Enrollment Act of 1863, also known as the Conscription Act, was passed by Congress. The Enrollment Act was a legislation that said that the government could require men to serve in the Union Army and fight in the Civil War. The act created exemptions from the draft, which included paying a fee of $300 or hiring a substitute. Many men could not afford the $300 because that was their average annual pay. This led to riots by New York citizens because they did not think it was a fair compromise.
Peter Carmichael, the director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, stated for the working class community of the New York City, especially the Irish, they felt that it, meaning the draft, fell on them in a disproportionate and unfair way.
Before the riots began, the Emancipation Proclamation was passed. It stated that in the rebel states and the territory that was not held by the Union, slaves would be freed. Many New Yorkers became uncomfortable with this proclamation because they felt that the freed slaves would take their jobs and opportunities. In July of 1863, the draft lottery began at 3rd Avenue and 47th Street. However, it was quickly interrupted when a group of 500 New Yorkers began violent protests against the drafts. Many recent immigrants, mostly the Irish, began to target African Americans. They began to beat up and even kill any they came across, including men, women, and children. They burnt down homes and buildings owned by freed slaves, and throughout the riots, many innocent people were killed.
Most of these people attacked were of color, and the rioters showed no mercy no matter how old or harmless they were. Lonnie Bunch, the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, said, "The fear was that many people saw it, meaning the draft, as, oh, you are now forcing us to fight for the freedom of Black Americans, and in New York City, a riot breaks out." Bunch also stated, "For some, they still felt the entire war was only about bringing the Union together and not doing anything for African Americans."
This is why the rioters opposed fighting for the freedom of African Americans at the time. On July 14, 1863, William Lord Garrison, a citizen of New England who was worried about the riots in New York, wrote a letter to a man named Oliver Johnson.
In that letter he wrote, "My heart bleeds to think of the poor, unoffending colored people of New York, outraged, plundered, murdered by the demons in human shape who now hold mastery over New York."
As the riots continued to spread, the men continued to attack and burn buildings. They targeted bars that would not sell liquor, public buildings like police stations, and even the mayor's residence. Any buildings or people who the rioters believed were beneficiaries of the war were attacked. Mobs up to 500 armed men were lighting building after building on fire.
On July 14th, a New York Times newspaper included the deadlines, "The mob in New York, resistance to the draft, rioting and bloodshed, conscription offices sacked and burned, private dwellings pillaged and fired, an armory and a hotel destroyed, colored people assaulted, an unoffending black man hung, the Tribune office attacked, the colored orphan asylum ransacked and burned, other outrageous and incidents, a day of infamy and disgrace."
One witness of the chaos was William Steinway, who was working in the family business, Steinway and Sons Pianist Factory. At the time, Steinway wrote journal entries as him and his brothers, Charles, watched the riots unfold.
On July 13th, he wrote, "Terrible excitement throughout the city. Resistance to the draft, rows of buildings on 3rd Avenue burning down. About 5 p.m., they appear before our factory. Charles speaks to them, and with the aid of Rev. Father Mahone, they draw off towards Yorkville, where late in the eve, many buildings are fired." Also, on July 14th, Steinway recorded, "All businesses in the upper part of the city suspended. Negroes chased everywhere and killed when caught."
Both these quotes show the riots from an average citizen's point of view and gave a different perspective of what happened. During the riots, the Steinways and their factory were definitely not safe. They always supported the Union and were afraid of their safety during all the violence.
In another part of his journal, William Steinway wrote, "I have been unable to eat for the last 3 days, except bread and drinking water for excitement."
In an attempt to spare the factory from any harm, Charles Steinway gave $30 to $40 to some of the rioters, as well as a $30 check. They also had an Irish Catholic priest, Father Mahone, talk to the mob. With this, they left the factory alone and carried on their way. William Steinway's story shows that even an average New York citizen was affected by the riots and nobody was safe. Eventually, the riots became too much for the New York City police to handle, and they had to call in more forces.
Edward S. Sanford of the U.S. Military Telegraph Service sent, "The riot has assumed serious proportions. It is entirely beyond the control of the police. Superintendent Kennedy is badly injured. So far, the rioters have everything their own way. They are estimated from 30,000 to 40,000. I am inclined to think from 2,000 to 3,000 are actually engaged. Appearances indicate an organized attempt to take advantage of the absence of military force."
2 days into the riots, Union soldiers who had just fought at Gettysburg were called into the city to try to stop the violence. By July 15th, though it seemed to be getting worse, fights instantly began between the soldiers and protesters. Rioters were fighting with the authority of all throughout New York City towns and neighborhoods, and neither side would go down without a fight. Sending the soldiers into the city was meant to calm down the riots, but it ended up causing more chaos and violence. At nightfall, on the 15th, the day's violence came to an end, but picked up again the next day. The morning of July 16th was the peak of the riots. More fights broke out and more people were killed, including rioters, authorities, and citizens. There were over 300 soldiers in that city that day, trying to calm down the rioters, but they continued to fight for what they wanted. The rioters weren't giving up, but neither were the police or soldiers. Finally, the authorities began to gain control over the mobs, and the riots began to calm down. The violence came to an end by the night of July 16, 1863. Between July 13th and July 16th, there were around 50 buildings burned to the ground. One of these buildings was the Colored Orphanage Asylum, which housed over 230 children. All the children were able to escape safely, but they watched their only home burn down before their eyes. Over 115 people died, including rioters and innocent civilians, as well as police officers and soldiers who were trying to calm down the riots. The anger of the rioters became a massacre of all different types of people, and it all started with the Enrollment Act. After the riots had ended, people in the city began making an effort to send their support to anyone who was affected.
For example, in order to help the African Americans who were targeted by the riots, the Committee of Merchants for the Relief of Colored People suffering from the late riots in the city of New York was formed.
They raised $12,983 to give to the African Americans who lost property or family members during the chaos. Overall, the Enrollment Act of 1863 was a compromise between the government and the wealthy class in the United States. This created conflict, and New York City erupted in race riots between immigrants and African Americans. But Lincoln had the army sent down to put down riots, and a peaceful resolution was found. Although an effort was being made to help out the citizens affected, some African Americans didn't want to continue living in a place where they had been so badly mistreated. Many left the city in the next 2 years, but those who couldn't leave banded together with others in their area who felt the same way they did. About a month after the riots ended, on August 19, 1863, the drafts peacefully began without any conflict. The New York City Draft Riots of 1863 hold a strong historical importance to this day. As the war continued, over 190,000 blacks eventually served in the Union Army. Although the white Northerners believed that their freedom would be threatened by the free blacks, in the end, their freedom helped the North win the war and actually end up saving many lives. The racism in the North intentionally deprived them from the help of African American soldiers in the war and was the cause of the riots. The riots are an example of how racism towards African Americans harmed the North as well as the South. The riots revealed how many immigrants, the poor, and the working class felt towards the draft, as well as how they felt about the slaves being freed, the conflicts and compromise of the riots, and the damage they inflicted upon New York City is warning about the damaging effect now and then.